This video is about code katas. Now, what is a kata? So this word actually comes from karate. Okay, so if any one of you does karate, then you know that you have katas there as well. So what what is that for? Okay, so let's say suppose you're practicing karate, right? If you do practice karate, then you don't just go in front of a person and punch them, right? Whenever you're practicing karate, you're going to do it in the air. Okay, so that is how we train. So if you want to be good at cleaning code, then you should also practice in a dummy situation. Okay, so that's what katas mean. So that's what code katas means. It just means that you are practicing to refactor in a code base that would not affect anything in the real world. Okay, and by that I just mean that I just mean that the code will not be used anywhere in the real world. Like it's not being run in a software, but it helps a lot with your learning of clean code. So let's move into it. Let me create a new folder and call it katas. And first kata that we'll be doing is expense report. Now, expense report, I've taken this kata from Christian Huer. If you don't know who he is a programmer with over 35 years of experience, and he's also my mentor. So I met him like 5 years or 4 years back, and then he taught me about these katas and stuff. So we'll be using this expense report kata as an example. And by the way, I talked to him, and then he says that this kata actually comes from Uncle Bob himself. Uncle Bob is Robert C. Martin, and he asked Robert C. Martin about the kata. And Robert C. Martin is also not the original inventor, and he has simply forgotten about who is the original creator of the kata. Okay, so let's look at what we are supposed to do. Let me just get the code. Copy the code over here, and I also need the main function, so I'm gonna get that. And so this is the program that we are going to be trying to refactor today. Okay, so if you look at this, then it's quite messy. There is a function that's a long function, very long function. It's trying to do something. I don't know what it is yet. And there is one small issue with this code, so let me actually fix that right now. Okay, let me fix that. Bad, right. Then so backslash t does not cut it. We need to have it pad, right? Okay, so this is the code we will be refactoring. Okay, when you look at this code, then you see that of course we're doing something with expense report, and it's gonna print report, but what is that print report doing? I am not entirely sure, because this is a long function. So I look at my main statement and I see that okay, I'm creating an instance of expense report, and I'm gonna print report for these. Okay, and let's actually try to run that. So when I run that is dart katas /1 expense report. Okay, so what it does is it prints out the expense report. Whatever we pass in over here, it is printing it out, and then it prints out an X if there is some kind of a threshold that gets crossed. Okay, and then it prints you the meal expenses and total expenses. Okay, now let me teach you how to refactor a code with zero knowledge. Okay, even if you don't know anything about the code, you can still refactor the code. So let's look at that. So I am going to look at print report. This is the one that I want to refactor, and I see that some things are happening, and the one thing I see is there's a if statement that's doing something. Okay, so let me refactor this if statement, and the way we do that is by creating a meaningful variable. So if you look at this, so let it just be is something. For now I don't really care what that is something is. I'm gonna name the variable properly later. Okay, so it's doing this. So if I simply look at this, then I'll see that it's checking for whether the expense type is dinner or if the expense type is breakfast. If I look at expense type, then it can be dinner, breakfast, or car rental. So dinner and breakfast actually is you can call it food, right? So let's say this is checking for, so I'm gonna do F2 and is food. Okay, that's what that's checking. So what I can do is this is still like a long condition, so I'm gonna move that into a function that is bool is food. Okay, and I'm gonna move that over here. I'm gonna return this, that is food. This variable is food over here does not create much value, so I'm just gonna return whatever this is. So it requires me to pass in expense, so let me pass in expense. Okay, so I'm not gonna look at that. So it's basically is food so I don't even need that variable over here anymore. I can just say is food for this expense. Okay, so yeah, is this expense a food? If it is food, then you're doing this. What does this statement do? So there is a variable meal expense and I'm adding the expense amount to it. Am I doing anything else with meal expenses down here? Nothing, just printing it, right? So this section of the code, what it is doing is it is okay, let me write it down. So this section of the code is trying to get total meal expense. Okay. Okay, now let's look at what this code is trying to do over here. This up to here. Okay, so let me do it over here as well. This statement, when I glance at it, it looks like it's checking the expense type and trying to figure out a name for that expense. So this is figuring out expense name via expense type. Okay. So if you look at this, this is switch statements. This is for an enum, right? So if it is for an enum, you can actually move this definition somewhere else. The way we do that is, here's how I'm gonna do it. I am gonna write an extension expense type utils on expense type. What this basically does is it's gonna extend that enum to have more functionality. So we just need the expense name, so I am gonna have a variable to get the name. The way we get name is this. Get that code, get it over here. What is expense? I don't need to care, I just need the type. So that type is this, and then expense name is this or this, right? So I can simply just return it. I don't even need that. Again, I think I can do return over here. No need of those break statements. Okay, so that's more cleaner. So now I need a way to get that expense name. The way I do that is by doing expense dot name. Okay, sorry, expense dot type dot name. Okay, that is the expense name. So this code now figuring out expense name is done in a single line. That's good. I see one more that is this is using a ternary operator, but it's doing something and it's checking if something is what is this? It is checking if something is out of this is some kind of a threshold, right? So the meal over expense marker, so is over expense. So this is probably what it's trying to do. So the way you check that is this condition. So let me actually move, this is a long condition, so let me move it to its own function. So bool is over expense. What do I need? I need expense, and this is the condition that I want. Now I'm gonna return that. Okay, whatever that is doing. So is over expense is now a function. So I'll call that function with expense, and I say this marker is gonna be x if it is over expense, otherwise it's not. Okay, that's more cleaner. So this part is figuring out marker. Okay, and that what is this doing? This code over here is printing expense. Okay, this code over here is calculating total expense. Okay, this over here is calculating total meal expense. Okay, what else can we do over here? Oh, I see something interesting over here. I see this date, right? So this date over here, basically just trying to print out the report date, right? So instead of having this, it's not immediately obvious to what this is doing. So I'm gonna move that like into a function. Okay, I'm gonna call that function void print expense report date. That's what I'm gonna call it. I will move these two lines over into the function, and I just need to call that function over here. So this is much more readable than this. Okay, so that's good. So I'm not gonna care a lot about this. Okay, and what else can we do over here? Okay, we see that figuring out marker is required to print expense. So this is again basically part of printing expense. Okay, so from here to here. Okay, now I see something interesting inside the for loop. Okay, this expense name is also important when you're trying to print it, right? So this is also a part of printing expense. So I think I see something that's going on inside the for loop. What I see is this for loop is trying to do three things. First one, that is calculating the total meal expense. Second one is printing the expense, and third one is calculating total expense. Okay, we can refactor this. So if you remember from our previous video, the way we refactor that is by creating more loops. Expenses, so calculating of the total meal expense, I am going to move it to this for loop. Okay, and other one is expense in expenses. Okay, so now we have three for loops that's doing three different things. Now if you're a normal person looking at this, you're probably cursing me right now because I've done something that's gonna take up computing resources, but I've explained before, this is good enough if what you're trying to do is you're trying to make the code readable. Okay, so by having three for loops instead of one, I have increased the complexity from n to 3n, but it's still okay because the code is more cleaner, because now my my concerns are separated, right? So this for loop is concerned with what now? Printing the expense. Okay, this for loop is concerned with computing total meal expense. This for loop is basically calculating the total expense. Now that are three different concerns, so it's okay to have three different for loops. So these three different concerns, I can still move it out into functions. One is print expense. Okay, that's what this for loop is for. So I'm going to print expense like, oops, that. And I need what now? A list of expense expenses. Okay, I can now move the calculation of total meal expense into another function. What is amount? Amount is integer, so I can basically return integer calculate meal expense. This should also be for list of expenses, and calculating the meal expense is going to be done this way. So for this I require a variable called meal expenses, return meal expenses. Okay, that's so now printing expense is going to be done like this, and then calculating of meal expense I can simply do it from over here. Okay, calculating the total expense, I can have another function for this, calculate total expense, list of expenses, and I just need to grab this for loop, paste it over here. I am going to require total expenses to be 0, and then return total expenses. Okay, that's good enough. So total expenses will be calculated like this. So that is good. So now when you look at this print report function, this is much cleaner and much easier to read, right? So when you look at print report, you will immediately realize that it is trying to print the expense report date. It will print the expenses S, because that's a better name, and then it's going to print out the meal expenses and the total expenses. Okay, so print report looks good now. What else can we refactor over here? Okay, so I see that when I'm calculating the total expense, I'm doing it with a for loop. This can be simplified, and the way to do that is by doing a reduce. So to calculate total expense, I can simply do expenses dot reduce and get a and a b. So a is the accumulator, b is the next element in the iteration. So the way I do that is by doing a plus b dot amount. Okay, and it's not allowing me to do that because it works differently in Dart. Reduce works differently in Dart, so I'm supposed to give out an expense. So instead of doing it this way, I'm going to do expenses dot map. I'm going to get an e, then I'm going to extract the amount from there, right? Then I'm going to reduce. So a and b are integers, so I can do simply a plus b. Okay, so all of this down to this. Now again, over here this total expenses variable does not make much sense because it's not adding in value to me, so I'm just going to return. Oh, I see a function with a single return statement, so I can simply just do it this way. Okay, so this is good enough. Next, okay, let me just fold that. Meal expenses, I can do the same thing for meal expenses as well. The way I do that is I do meal expense is equals to expenses dot, I'm gonna map it. I'm just gonna get everything that is food, and then I am gonna reduce it, get a and b. Oh, I cannot get a and b, I need to map it. Oh sorry, this one is not map, this is supposed to be filter. So I'm gonna filter out every expenses, right, that is a food, and then I'm gonna get the amount from those expenses, and then I'm gonna reduce it and get the total meal expense. So I'm gonna return meal expense. Okay, so what I have essentially done over here, don't be confused. If I ignore everything else, then this statement will give me all the expenses that qualifies this if statement. Okay, that's what the where is for. So, and this map statement, okay, this will take every expenses that is food, whatever this test is, if it passes. So if this is true, then I'm gonna get all of the amount from there. and then I'm gonna reduce it and get the number. Okay, so I don't need these anymore. Again, meal expenses over here does not make much sense. This variable does not make much sense because it does not add in value, so I can just return it. Oh, I see a function with a single return statement, so I'll just do it this way. So good enough. This goes away. Print expenses. I am iterating over expense. I'm calculating the expense name. I'm calculating the marker. So yeah, this is good enough. Doing anything else would not probably add much value over here. So this is good. Print expense report date. Excuse me. This is good enough. Is over expense. Okay. So here's something interesting. So when I glance at this function, I don't immediately know what it is that this function is trying to do, right? So this condition is not really clear. So even though this is compact, it's not clear to me. I cannot read it, so I should probably refactor it. Okay, so I can refactor. So this case looks like it's a threshold for dinner. Okay, so I can just simply say cross or let's say passes threshold for dinner. Okay, so that is a boolean. It passes threshold for dinner, and this other one is passes threshold for what was that for? It's breakfast. Bool passes threshold for breakfast. Okay, that is this. This still does not read quite well. So instead of this, let's do it this way. Okay. What I should do is let's see how I can make it better. So is over expense. So it looks like we are only checking is over expense if the type is food. Okay, so I can do something like if it is not food, then I will always return false. Okay, because I'm not checking anything that's not food. Okay, if it is food, then it can be of two types, which is if it is dinner. So let's do this. So if it is dinner, then I am gonna return expense should be greater than 500. Okay, if expense dot type is expense type dot breakfast, then I am going to return expense amount less than whatever this is. So I don't need to do these anymore. Okay, so what was my original case? I should say passes threshold or breakfast. Okay, if any one of this is true, then it is true, otherwise it's false. Okay, so what is my last condition? It's false, right? Okay, so that makes sense. So I don't need this top if statement anymore, because not food just means that you're not this or this, so let's just remove that. So this reads much more easier. That's because I can just say that if it is over expense, if the expense type is dinner, where if the expense type happens to be dinner, then we're checking the expense amount greater than 500. So that reads out easily than what we are doing before. So if this is true, then you check the expense amount to be greater than 100. So we went from a cryptic condition to a condition that reads in terms of expense amount. Okay, because that's all that we're checking. So this looks good. Now is food. That looks good as well. So this does not really do anything. So if you wanted to, you could add descriptive variables, but I don't think that's required. So is dinner is this, and is breakfast. Okay. So this reads out much better than if we have a long statement that spans multiple lines. Okay. Next, what else we can do for here? So you see that every time I call is food or I call is over expense, I do it for expense variable, right? So what I can do is, instead of having these two functions as a part of expense report, I should probably have it as a part of expense. The expense itself should know if it is food. Yeah, so the way I do that is I'm going to move this definition over here. I don't need to pass in that expense anymore because I can have that type variable inferred. Okay, I can do the same thing for over expense. I can have it inside a class. I don't need to pass in expense anymore. Expense, wherever I see expense dot, that is just going to be this, and I don't need to pass in this dot and dart. It is smart enough to figure it out. So great. Now all of the functions are where it should belong, I believe. Okay, so that looks good. So now there should be some problems over here. So that is over expense does not exist now. The way you call that is by doing expense dot is over expense. And another one would be is food is no longer available here. So the way you would do that would be e dot is food. So this is much easier to read. So where e is food and e get a e dot amount and do stuff. So yeah, I think that's all. Okay, so let's see what else we can do in this code. Okay, so over here I'm using switch statements to do this. Okay, I'm using switch statements. Can I do this better? Can I do this better? So this is actually good enough. What I could do over here is I can take these expense type. So instead of having it as expense type, I can probably change something over here, but that would be too much of a hassle. So we're gonna leave it over here. So this is good enough. So I can read this code better now. So let me go one more step. That is, I am gonna separate out these code based on its concerns. Okay. So expense type over here is a model. I'm going to do model. It's actually an enum, so let's have something else for enums. Okay, or enum, I could call it anything, I don't really care. So I am gonna have expense type dot dart. Okay, expense type is an enum, so I'm gonna move it to its own file. I can move it like that. Am I recording? Yep. So now it gives me a few errors, but I'm not gonna care about that right now. So expense over here is a model, so I'm gonna move that over here. Expense dot dart. I moved it over here. So this problem is because it cannot find stuff. Let me make it find stuff. So everything is good with expense. Expense reports should be a part of its own class. So what is an expense report anyways? It's a utility function. It is a utility class. Yeah, let me just have it at top level. Expense report dot dot. So expense report is now its own thing. I need to get expenses. Do I need anything else? Does not look like it. So this reads out well. Okay. Next thing is expense report dot. So instead of one, this should probably called main. Okay, so let me just move it to one expense report. So I'm going to move all of these. Why am I not able to select everything to a single folder? So this is better. Okay, I have a main.dart and I need to import stuff in main.dart, and everything is good. Okay, so this looks good. Let's try to run that. Dart katas error. Okay, dart kata /1 expense report main.dart. Okay, everything looks good. Okay, so we just cleaned up our mess into proper folder structures. What else can we do? Okay, let's look at expense report. So here is something interesting about expense report. Okay, if I do expense report, so let me just clear the screen for you to understand what you're supposed to be looking at. So you're supposed to be looking at main.dart over here. So let me teach you one last thing. That is, if I do expense report and I do a dot, I see that I have these functions. Okay, these functions, I am only interested in print report. I'm not interested in any other functions. Okay, so after this dot, I can see all of these functions. I can call all of these, right? So this the way of using expense report is known as the API for expense report. So I am exposing functions that I would not require outside of expense report. Okay, so I have to fix that. So I go into expense report. So any function that I am not supposed to call from outside expense report should be a private function. The way you make private function in Dart is by adding a underscore in front of the function. So I'm going to rename the function and add underscore to any function that should not be callable from outside of expense report. Great. So now that all of these functions are private, if I go look at expense report, then my API for expense report will only expose print report method. So that's good. That is what I want. So this is how you can perform refactoring.